Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today, we are going to be discussing the persistent threats of Al-Shabaab, the African Union-led missions in Somalia and Somalia's stability. I'm joined by a very special guest, Omar Mahmood. Omar Mahmood is Senior Eastern African Analyst at the International Crisis Group. Omar, it's a great pleasure to have you join me. I look forward to our conversation.
Oh, thank you for having me, Michael.
Brilliant, brilliant. So let me start off. In the last, I think since, so we see Somalia has experienced decades of conflict and was often seen as a failed state. Well, we've seen since 2012, when the federal government of Somalia was established, we've seen some kind of like progress that showed some direction towards stability, although fragile. So I wanted to start off by asking you if you can describe the progress that have been achieved so far, the threats that remain, and the opportunities that Somalia has to reach this destination.
Sure. So since the establishment of the federal government in Somalia in 2012, we've seen a number of progress initiatives, especially related to state building and a little bit on counterterrorism as well, which I think are the two biggest objectives of that project. So on the state building side, you've had the establishment of a federal government. It has created member states in most of the country, and so there's about 5 of those right now. One predated this establishment in Puntland, but the rest came into being between 2013, 2016. You've had a number of elections held. Now, these have been problematic in one sense because they've been incredibly narrow, relying on clan elders or just a small base outside of that. And they've been incredibly corrupt as well. But what they have done is produce rotation of power at the highest level that's been accepted. And so each passing election, you had one in 2012, one in 2017, another one in 2022, produced leadership change, different president, and this was accepted, throughout Somalia as well. On top of that, you have right now basically the third layer of the government, I would argue, trying to be established. So you have the federal government at the top, you have the member states below this, and now there's a push to form these district councils throughout much of the member states. And this is proceeding at different levels within Somalia, but basically it's, the next phase along that. On top of this, I think you've had some diplomatic achievements, especially recently. For example, Somalia's the 30-year plus arms embargo imposed by the UN was recently lifted at the end of last year. There's been a big push over the last couple of years for some economic reforms, which resulted in Somalia achieving a debt relief status with the IFIs, the international financial institutions. And so you've had some other achievements like that. For example, Somalia is going to serve in the UN Security Council next year. On the counterterrorism side, fighting Al-Shabaab, I think the picture is much more mixed. You've had a lot of support from this African Union force, which basically pushed Al-Shabaab out of urban areas. But the Somali government struggled to backfill some of those, and the mission kind of got stuck. And there's an ebb and flow to this. You've had some spurts of significant activity. One was around middle 2022 towards early 2023, where there's this new offensive linked with some clan militias in parts of the country that was able to clear, parts of central Somalia. But the problem has always been kind of holding those areas. It hasn't been pushing Al-Shabaab out. It's been kind of holding in what happens after that. And so I think that's still been a bit of a challenge. The overarching dynamic, I would argue, which is why I think we see some progress but some challenges in both state building and both counterterrorism, has been I don't think there's been enough attention paid to sort of the peace building aspect of this wider process. There's a lot of grievances still at the very localized level, which then tend to flare up or tend to impede wider cooperation, whether that's trying to establish a district council, whether that's trying to create a unified force in a particular area to take on Al-Shabaab. And so I think that's still a big deficit. But in short, I think there's certainly been progress. Sometimes it's hard to see that on a day-to-day, but there's still a lot that remains to be done.
Yeah, very, very interesting. You've mentioned very two important stuff that I want to hold on to. Well, let me start from the security side of things. So you rightly said that there've been some mixed results in terms of the fight against Al-Shabaab, and the problem is not so much about pushing Al-Shabaab. It's about retaining those territories that have been gained, or those progress that have been made. So relating to that, in the past couple of recent times, we've seen some sort of, I wouldn't say, maybe you might disagree or agree with me, a resurgence of, or an increased escalation in Al-Shabaab's attacks across the countries. We've seen in the beach attack, the cafe attack, and the jailbreak attempts. What is leading to this spike in Al-Shabaab's attack?
At some level, I think there's a natural ebb and flow to some of these attacks. So we see some spikes, and then we see some periods where there's not a lot of activity, at least in Mogadishu, for example. In the countryside, there's daily activity and daily engagements as well. But it's the big attacks in Mogadishu, or sometimes some other cities, that makes a lot of headlines. And so we see an ebb and flow to that at some level. But I think what's happened in the past month is a bit worrying, because there was a sense of calm that had developed in Mogadishu, let's say over the past year or so, a greater sense of security. There had been some reforms within Mogadishu's securities framework, some new forces that had come in, some replacement of old commanders and whatnot, some new technology, particularly the use of cameras to do surveillance and whatnot. And so there had been a lot of these reforms put in place since this current government came to power about 2 years ago. And that had sort of stemmed the tide a bit on some of the big attacks that we'd seen in Mogadishu. And, even just from my visits to the city, there was a sense that, people felt freer, felt more secure. And so I think the couple attacks we saw in the last month kind of shatters or questions that sense of calm a little bit. But at some level, I always felt, this is not sustainable, because you have these periods where, attacks do decrease a little bit and people feel a bit more freer. And then you have kind of a reaction as well. There's an ongoing war, and Al-Shabaab is constantly trying to infiltrate Mogadishu, trying to hit at the heart of the government. And so I think what the group does is at times, it's more difficult for them. At times, they're exploiting vulnerabilities wherever they see them. Whenever there's a vulnerability, they will target that. And so if we look at the wider context, about a year ago, or a bit more than a year ago, especially when this offensive was going on, there was a lot of pressure on Al-Shabaab, especially in some of the countryside areas, in central Somalia in particular. And so there was a lot probably of their focus going towards that. Over the last year, that offensive has kind of stalled. So there hasn't been as much pressure on them outside in the rural areas. At the same time, you have political issues, which then take up the bandwidth of the government. We have to remember, this is still a nascent government. Yes, the transition from the transitional government to federal government did take place 12 years ago. But I would argue the government's still very much in transition. It's still very much establishing itself, establishing its structures, extending its governance throughout the country, deepening, what it can do and provide in the country. And so it's hard, I think, to have to do a lot of things at once. And what's been happening over the past 6 months, for example, there's been a lot of focus on some constitutional reviews and changes, and I think that's taken up a lot of government attention and a lot of focus within Parliament in trying to push some of these as well. And it probably distracts from being able to maintain pressure and offensive as well. I think it's just hard to do 2 or 3 things at one time in a very significant way. So that probably plays into it as well. Thirdly, there were these reforms that took place in Mogadishu. But Al-Shabaab will chink away at those over time. Maybe commanders have been replaced, and over time they'll find a way to find some new vulnerabilities in some of these checkpoints. So they're constantly doing that, and so it's a constant battle, really. I don't think you can ever be complacent as long as the war is continuing, and you have an actor that's as capable and adjustable as Al-Shabaab is. So you will have those periods of calm. I mean, hopefully what's happened over the last couple of months is, again, another wake-up call. The government can kind of study what went wrong in some of those and then be able to get back to that sense. But I think there is an ebb and flow to this, and as long as the war is continuing, I think we'll continue to see these sort of spikes at various times.
You mentioned a continuing war, and there's something interesting that you said, the second part I was going to actually to expatiate on. So we've seen some progress in state building, some in counterterrorism, but you mentioned a third layer that has been given very little attention, which you call peace building. And in my own research is what I call prioritizing stability over addressing, core or root causes, if you want to say. Can you expatiate on that? What you mean by peace building aspect has received little aspect? What does it mean in terms of, in practical sense?
Certainly. I think it's a great question and topic to dive into. On the Somali case, so for example, there are a plethora of grievances that exist within the Somali clan system. And some of these date back to the collapse of the government and the civil war that happened after that in the early 1990s, and a lot of the excesses that really haven't been addressed. There's a very strong dispute resolution dynamic within the Somali clan system. But what happened in the early 90s kind of overwhelmed that, and it was very difficult to really respond to that appropriately. And some of those, haven't really been responded over time as well. Now, there was a basic settlement that happened more or less at the top layer of the clan framework. So there's 4 major clan families in Somalia. And so there's this 4.5 formula that basically divides up the government system. And that means the 4 major clan families have an equal share of government positions, and then the 0.5 is for minorities. They get half a share. So if you look at the way parliaments divvied up, it corresponds to the 4.5 clan formula. Same within government positions. There's always an informal rotation. For example, the president's usually from one of the 2, even more dominant clans within the clan family, and the prime minister's from the other. So there's this constant rotation. And so there is a basic settlement, but that doesn't translate all the way down throughout the system. And at the very granular level, many of the subclans have grievances from a long time ago, or continue to have issues with a lot of their neighbors at times over questions of natural resources. So control of water, for example, is a big one, or pasture land. Some of those then get attached to political grievances as well, and become more entrenched issues, especially when unresolved and you have these cycles. And so what I bring this up is I think in the first phase of the Somali state building sort of trajectory, which was a lot of these peace conferences in the late 90s and early 2000s, you had the basic framework that came into being, this 4.5 formula and this decision to set up a government on top of that. But there was this assumption that was all the peace building that needed to be done. Now we could move on to the state building phase. But what I would argue is that didn't go deep enough, and the foundations then for continuing state building aren't strong enough at the local level. So for example, now, we talk about the formation of some district councils. In some districts, this has been an incredibly contested process because subclans have been arguing over who gets what number of seats, or arguing, because of some of these grievances from before that have never been addressed, that they can't work with that sort of certain subclan or whatnot. This also plays out in the war against Al-Shabaab. The offensive that the Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud government undertook from 2022, to early 2023, basically there was a different model there where they partnered with local clan militias in order to take on Al-Shabaab. And that was a little different. Before, it was much more formal security leading the fight, and this was more of a partnership, and that worked well in certain areas. But it's also run into challenges in other areas where there's contestations between subclans over who is in control of what areas, or who post Al-Shabaab would be in control of this. And without resolving that, without bringing that reconciliation discussion to the forefront, then it's very difficult to create and maintain a sense of unity to pursue Al-Shabaab in those areas. And Al-Shabaab feeds off of these divisions. They're very good at analyzing the clan level to a very granular dynamic, and either supporting one side or instigating conflict, or jumping on top of already ongoing grievances and exacerbating them. And so, I think the basic trajectory has been building the structure of the state and continuing to do that at a more macro level. But the peace building foundations have been neglected a bit, because there was this assumption that the macro level peace dynamics that were agreed on were good enough to build on it. And the rest would sort of come through the state building trajectory. But I think that's a bit of a flawed assumption. And we need to spend a bit more time from the ground peace building up in order for this to function more smoothly.
Very interesting. Like one of the things I've seen when you look at state building, let's look at Africa as a whole. I look at many African countries are products of former European colonial masters, colonialism. And we look at state building and see that most African states seems to be similar in terms of like the plurality of the people in their ethnicity. But Somalia is quite distant in terms of like it kind of has like majority a homogeneous kind of like ethnicity in terms of that. But it still hasn't been able to be free of some of those dynamics that we have in most post-colonial African states. So I wanted to touch on that and see, relating that to issue of what we're seeing, for instance, in Somaliland, or what we're seeing in Western Sahara, or, even in Biafra with secession and, people calling for seceding and self-determination. But in Somalia, why is they similar? Why are we saying that if it has that kind of like homogeneous compared to most African states? Why is it similar stuff then?
Yeah, so Somalia is a paradox in a lot of ways. So you're right that at some level, I mean, it's all ethnically Somalis. There's a common language, even though there's different dialects within that, but there's a common sort of religion, even though there's different strands within that, and there's a common ethnicity, even though there's different subclans within that. So on the surface, there is a great deal of commonality and unity, and this is why you've seen in the past, for example, a political project to basically unite the Somali inhabited areas of the Horn, this Greater Somalia project, which if you look at the colonial history, the areas in which Somalis live in the Horn have been divided in 5 different ways. Parts of Djibouti, parts of eastern Ethiopia, northern Kenya, then of course Somalia, and Somaliland, the former British colony. As well. So it's kind of divided in 5 ways. And there was this political project to unite, saying we are all Somalis, we should all be under one sort of administration. And so you have that juxtaposed at the same time with a very strong level of division as well, and lack of unity. So you kind of have that macro unity and nationalistic push. But then if you look a bit deeper within the clan dynamic and the clan system, it's a very complicated system in which there's almost continual layers, almost infinite layers, basically down to a very low level, and there is a lot of kind of dissonance within that, and so basically it's fluid. So someone can basically be a member of a very small, clan segment in this particular dispute. But then in this political dispute, all of a sudden they identify as a very high level, and then in this particular dynamic, they identify somewhere in the middle. And so that fluidity is very complicated, and I think is a bit of a challenge, and it's probably different than I think some of the other contexts, at least the degree to which how fluid it can really be, and how much this can kind of change. And so I think you have that very interesting juxtaposition where sometimes you see the strong nationalistic push. And you do see a lot of unity and a very impressive sort of mobilization around that. But then at other times you see, divisions at a very, very, very micro level. And so I think that speaks to the paradox of Somalia. But I think the problem is some of those divisions at the micro level tend to flare up because, what I mentioned before, the lack of sort of addressing some of these grievances and whatnot. And so if you look at, for example, the Somaliland case, Somaliland was a separate separate colony. It was colonized by the British, while Somalia was colonized by the Italians. They agreed at the time of decolonization to join that unity. This was part of the greater Somalia project. This was seen as the first step. The problem in Somaliland's perspective is they always felt marginalized. As soon as they kind of joined their clan there, they felt they weren't getting their fair share of rights and whatnot. And then once, they kind of a rebellion started there was a very strong repression and, very, very, repressive actions, especially targeting the big cities in Somaliland. Hargeisa was essentially flattened. And so then that kind of seared in their mind this idea that, we have to be separate from the Somali case. So it starts, from this idea of what is our clan's position within this wider framework, but then it's exacerbated by grievances and repression and the way kind of the conflict dynamics played out. And so I think that's why you get that division, and it juxtaposes with that wider greater Somalia push. And so there is a fluidity to that, though, which is key, because you might have this division at the lower level at one point, but then at another point, you're going to have that nationalistic push again. And so, I think there's never a permanence here, and that's what makes the context so complicated.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So let's move into to some of the external intervention. So we've seen from 2007, we've seen the AU-led missions, and we've seen transitions as well. But let's start off from these AU-led peace operations. First of all, AMISOM, that was established in 2007, and then we've seen that being replaced by ATMS. So how do you assess these AU peace interventions, starting from AMISOM? What was AMISOM's mandate, and has he achieved his mandates? Did he achieve his mandates? What do you think of that?
So I think at its core, the rationale behind the AU missions in Somalia was to provide space for the Somali state building project essentially to take root. So for the Somali government to be formed, for the Somali government to start establishing itself, for the Somali government to then start extending outside Mogadishu and into the rest of the country. And if you measure it from that core objective, then yes, I do think the AU mission has achieved what it was setting out to do. Now, the mission has evolved over time and basically became part of the war against Al-Shabaab, and the objective then became the elimination, and then when that proved maybe impossible, the degradation of Al-Shabaab, and it essentially became a war fighting mission as time went on. But I think you have to look at there's a lot of complaints today about what the AU mission is doing or not doing, but I think you have to look at the wider trajectory and basically ask yourself, would any of the external actors who are present in Somalia today be there if the AU hadn't gone in 2007? I would argue not. I think the AU did provide that space. However, the mission does need to transition. I mean, you can't rely on that forever. It's a short-term stopgap solution. It is not the solution. It's basically the measure to get you to a longer-term solution. And so what happened with the mission is from 2007 to maybe 2015 or so, it was very active and offensive. It took back a lot of territory from Al-Shabaab, pushed Al-Shabaab out of the capital, Mogadishu. Then, neighbors Ethiopia and Kenya intervened and kind of then became part of the mission once again, pushed Al-Shabaab out of Kismayo, some other key urban areas. So it did take back a lot. Anywhere where the government is present today, for the most part in Somalia, was taken back because of the AU mission. The problem was that the backfill from the Somali forces was very slow to materialize and slow to develop. So the theory was the AU would push out, the Somali forces would come, take over that area, then the AU would push out again, and so on until you basically pushed Al-Shabaab out of the country. Well, the AU would push out, and then it was very difficult for kind of the Somali forces to get there. And so I think you got to a point of stasis. And that probably happened around 2015 after a series of offensive operations that took back a lot of territory. And then I think that kind of changed the mentality of the mission a little bit, where they became a bit more comfortable hunkering down in some of these urban areas, even as Somali capabilities continue to develop. And so you see a shift, and that's where a lot of the complaints are about what the AU is not doing today, is not being as offensive and operational today. It really comes from that second phase. I would argue there's been two phases. And now I know we've gone from AMISOM to ATMIS, and we're going to go to ALSOM, the African Union. I think it's the stabilization and whatnot mission in Somalia going forward. But I would argue this is just the continuation of the same trend. This is still the AU mission. This is still just prolonging sort of the transition and buying more time. So rather than seen as three distinct missions, I think it's a longer trend line of the same dynamic. And so we're getting to the point where, Somali capabilities are improving a bit. And so there's more pressure on the transition side, but there's still a tension here between the ambitions, for maybe a full transition, and especially Somali ambitions for full transition, and the realities on the ground. And so I think that's why you see a lot of plans put on paper that are developed about, drawing down AU forces from here and whatnot, and Somali backfill. And then when it comes time to implement those plans, all of a sudden, there's a delay, or there's a change in those plans and whatnot. And it's not to say that the Somali forces aren't also, capable of taking some of that responsibility, but it's that there's just a gap between what's assumed on paper and what's actually possible, and then you meet somewhere in the middle. And that's why we keep seeing these delays. That's why we keep seeing these follow-on missions. I do think transition is happening. It's just not happening at the pace that was expected. And honestly, that was probably always an unrealistic pace. We have to remember this is a Somali army that's essentially starting from scratch, that's redeveloping itself, that's generating forces at the same time as fighting Al-Shabaab, at the same time as holding areas, because some of the holding forces when it comes to police and other forces are lacking. And then at the same time is being asked to take over areas that the African Union mission had been holding. And so I think that's just a lot to ask for any army. I think the ATMIS timeline, when you looked at it, I think it was 33 months to transition from 20,000 odd AU troops to zero in Somalia was always unrealistic. And I think everyone probably would secretly agree on that, but they wanted to keep the momentum and keep the idea of transition going. But that's why we see a follow-on mission that is up and coming now, that's being debated, that essentially continues that transition. It prolongs it a little bit. But I wouldn't say that means no transition is happening. I would just say that it's happening at a slower pace.
Very, very interesting. You did mention that this is a stopgap, because we've had previous episodes where we've looked at the UN missions, look at this different kind of language or narrative, peace building, or you call it peace building, or you call it stabilization missions. I call it all of these different narratives has their own. They have their own kind of implications for how the conflict ends or how peace is being restored. So we've seen with the Somali case as well. We've seen different names. We've seen AMISOM, now we see transition, now we see support and stability. And from what you say, which is quite interesting, even though they have these different names, you still see it as one long trend of a thing. So now if we see it as a short-term goal, but it does look like it's turning into a a long term without neglecting or without the change that has happened, the gains that have been made, but you still see it as it's going to be a long time. It's not going to be. What is it about the Somali army besides the short time frame that they've had to develop this army from scratch? What is it about that is delaying their capability? Are they not receiving the right training? Is it, what do you think besides the time frame could be affecting the takeover?
Well, so there's probably some very technical aspects to that question as well, about logistics, about support, about being able to supply. So we've seen this in the offensive that the government was taking, that I mentioned. Some of that stalled because it's been very difficult to sort of resupply the Somali army that far out country, or maintain the logistics supply chains. Part of it is, yes, new soldiers are being generated and trained, but at the same time, does that equate to the same level of experience? From, it's not a numbers game. You take out one AU soldier and you put one Somali in and expect that to be the same. I don't think that's a fair way to estimate it, but a lot of the drawdown has basically been predicated on a numbers game, saying, okay, we're taking down 5,000, AU soldiers now. Somalia trains, 5,000 up and whatnot. So I think part of that, there's that issue, and it's about building up over time. I think it's difficult to build a coherent fighting force. So there's some technical aspects to that question, but I would argue the underlying sort of fundamental aspect of why this has been so difficult is still more political. And if you look at the AU mission, if you look at peacekeeping missions around the world, or peace enforcement, or all of these, the most successful ones have always been tied to a very specific political strategy. And what I would argue in the Somali context is this is happening in silos. The AU mission is just the security side of things. The political side of things is not being dealt with the AU mission, which is maybe appropriate to have this division of labor. It's really the UN that kind of takes that on, and that's kind of how things were agreed on. But at the same time, to what degree is this interconnected, and to what degree is there a coherent political strategy related to how the AU troops will exit Somalia? Right now, if you look at the exit strategy, it is the same as it's always been, even for the new mission that's coming up. It's the degradation of Al-Shabaab, and it's the buildup of the Somali forces to the point where basically they can contain the security threat that Al-Shabaab is, contain the issue within Somalia. So it doesn't affect the region. Somalia is on its own, essentially, for that. That's how I read the exit strategy. For the AU mission side, they can only do so much on that. The degradation of Al-Shabaab, they can work on that. The training of Somali security forces, even outside their realm. This is happening bilaterally with a bunch of different partners that the Somali government manages. However, what is the political strategy around that? What is the dynamic around overcoming some of the divisions I mentioned at the local level? Even within the federal level, there's a very big dissonance between the federal government of Mogadishu and the member states within the country. There's a very wide divergence over how the federal model should operate in Somalia, over what's the appropriate division of resources and of power, what's the vision for the future of governance. Some of this is playing out in these constitutional debates and dynamics that's undergoing in the country right now. But for example, you've had a member state in Puntland that basically has suspended its participation in the federation since early last year. So there's no, there doesn't seem to be a political strategy in terms of around that. I would argue there's not even a political strategy in terms of what the future is with Al-Shabaab. We always say that there's no military solution to this problem, but if you look at what's happening, it's essentially military, or some aspects related to military counter-finance, but it's still related to the degradation or the elimination of the group. There's not a political strategy around that. And so I think part of the dissonance is yes, you can build up Somali capabilities, but there's still no wider overarching political strategy. The mission's not tied into that. The wider state building trajectory, I don't think is tied to something that coherent. And the central point of why I would argue this is if you look at the Somali National Army, it is by leaps and bounds more capable and stronger than it was 10 years ago. But can we really argue that the conflict is any closer to resolution than it was 10 years ago? I would argue not. And so to me, that shows the deficiencies of not having a coherent political strategy that focusing more on the military side. And I think that's where the mission has then gotten kind of stuck in that dynamic as well.
Very interesting. We had I'll refer back to the guests we had previously, that I was looking at these missions and then comparing it to, he called it use the term stabilization dilemma, which is something I'm working on a new project that I'm doing. It's exactly what you're describing, where he was saying, whereas the missions in the 90s were, they sought out political solutions, they were tied to political solutions, or diplomatic approaches to this. But what we've seen in recent missions is just purely stabilization, purely short-term, purely. And then I wanted to link that up to the Somali Stabilization Fund that was established, I think it was in 2012, where they've integrated security and development together, basically securitizing development. But I guess I wanted to finish up on this note. So if you take a broad outlook and say, what do you project? So one, how do you see Somali moving forward? Let's even say the next 10 years, with all of the missions, with the clan politics, and then the third layer you talked about, the district level. How do you see all of this playing out? Where do you see Somalia in the next 10 years? I guess that's I wanted to conclude on that.
Yeah, no, it's a big question and a difficult one to bite off. Things happen so quickly within this region as well. That things that are unexpected, even for people who have been observing for quite some time. But if you look at the Somali case, I think at some point there's going to be an inflection point. Right now the push is for more, Somali capacity. Yes, we see this in the security forces kind of taking over for international actors. You might see that in the economic arena a little bit as well, with the sort of the debt relief dynamic. There's sort of a push that, yes, Somalia at some point would need to be shifting from a grant-based approach to more loans and more responsibility for the economic situation. But I think part of the problem is, where is the sustainability within the model to date? So every time we see, the AU forces kind of draw down, we see some security gaps around that. And Somalis can fill some of those, but not all of those. That's the central tension there. If you look on the economic side, the government budget, I think 70% of it comes from external sources. Yes, the government's increased its tax revenue and its tax base, but at the same time, government operating costs have also increased. So are they really closing that gap? Where's the sustainability in that going forward? And so that's the central question here. Yes, I think there's been progress within the wider state building project, if we want to call it that, that's overtaken over the last 10, 20 years, certainly. But is it at a sustainable level, and where will that sustainability come in the future? And so I think at some point we get to an inflection point. What I would argue is without addressing without incorporating that peace building dynamic more strongly into what's currently ongoing state building or counterterrorism wise, then I think it's always going to be a struggle to the point where, Somalia is a bit vulnerable because it is so dependent externally, security wise, economically wise, whatever else, on the government, that, if those external actors are fed up or don't feel like continuing this project, that pulling support or drawing it down quite significantly will affect the continuation or the ability of the current government as we know it to continue. It's not currently at a sustainable rate, and the question is always, how long is that going to take? Where's that going to come? I would argue, the government would be more coherent and in a stronger footing if more of the reconciliation dynamics were included within it, because it creates a bigger unity of purpose and overcomes some of those divisions. And so I think this is the inflection point within the next 10 years, I imagine would happen at some level. And whether, what trajectory Somalia would go on basically depends on, I think, the two X factors. One, to what degree some of the reconciliation dynamics can be embedded into the current frameworks and really make progress. And two, to what degree are the current donors willing to continue the way it's gone, or are there new donors that are willing to come in? So there's always, this talk about non-traditional actors, some of the Gulf actors, or Turkey, maybe even further afield, China and whatnot. They've shown some interest in Somalia. I would argue their interest, though, has come on the backs of the current, what's the space that's been provided. I don't think it's necessarily an interest to sort of take over that wider project and be the sole kind of supporters of it. I think it's rather more complementary. And so I think when we're projecting, it's difficult to say one way or the other, but I think there's a couple different scenarios. And unfortunately, I think without significant reform, the scenario where donors get frustrated and, maybe the mission draws down and, there's lack of, true reform, the government struggles to really demonstrate its value or expand its presence outside the country, questions its sustainability. I do think with reforms, though, that then we can get to basically the end state that I think everyone's trying to push to, which is a stable Somalia, which it has, a sovereign responsibility for its internal affairs, meaning, again, that the security threats, whether that's Al-Shabaab, whether that's also piracy, for example, or other dynamics, don't extend beyond Somalia's borders, and Somalia can handle that. And so, I think it's hard to say exactly which way the trajectory would be, but what I would argue, and I think some of the research we're doing at Crisis Group would push, is say, without, to get to that end state we want, that there does need to be some reforms that happen, and one of the biggest one is integrating the reconciliation side, I think, more strongly into what's currently ongoing.
Well, thank you very much, Omar. This is so rich and insight. Like, I agree with you. It's difficult to project. We've had a state that has been unstable for a long time, but yet again we've seen some progress. Yes, it's very difficult, but you've done an amazing job in providing a very, very objective assessment. We're very, very grateful to have you join us today. Thank you very much, Omar. Thank you for joining
Certainly.
me today.
No, thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion, and I'm glad you're looking at the case as well and asking some of the deeper questions.
Brilliant. You have a brilliant day and enjoy.
Appreciate it. Take care, Michael.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you once again for tuning in to another inspiring episode on Somalia's stability, the different African Union-led missions, and the persistent threat of Al-Shabaab. Join me as usual to thank our guest, Omar Mahmood, for his rich insights into this topic. As usual, I implore you to join me again next week for another inspiring episode. For now, stay blessed and I'll see you.